We'll be starting our new series of lessons on First Peter. And as I have mentioned a couple of times leading up to this week, I'm going to be piggybacking the Bible class and the sermon lesson together to the best of my abilities. There will probably be some Sundays where that's not going to be possible, but to the best of my ability, I'm going to try to do that. And that provides us with a couple of opportunities, options that I really appreciate. Number one, we can look at some more of the technical stuff during our Bible class. And obviously, we want to look at those in context and try to come up with some applications that are useful for us. But then for our worship service, then we can take that material and look at what we can learn, that which draws us closer to God. And I am going to try to the best of my ability this year in the formal worship service to really focus on that goal, that our lessons during our worship service will be designed to really bring us closer to God, to challenge us where we need to be challenged, and to encourage us where we need to be encouraged. I want to begin by just reminding us, I don't think there's anything in this first paragraph that is particularly new or earth-changing, but just wanted to, because First Peter is one of the shorter letters, one of the shorter books in the New Testament, perhaps if we could get ourselves off on the right foot and get ourselves started with Bible study this year, then we can transfer that to some of the other texts that we'll be looking at this year. So how do we study a book of the Bible? Well, my first suggestion is that we read the material as many times as we can during the week, from beginning to end, if possible. And I realize there are some passages, some collections of biblical material where that is difficult. I don't want to say impossible, but the book of Isaiah is 66 chapters. Now, that's not something that you can sit down with your cup of coffee in the morning, unless you have a really big mug, and get through in a morning. Or sit down with a cup of tea after supper and read from beginning to end. First Peter is a whopping 5 chapters long, and they're not real long chapters. And so even if you don't read quickly, it is not difficult to read the entire letter in one sitting. And if you wanted to break it up half in the morning and half in the evening, that would be easy enough to do. But you would be constantly reading. And the value of that is that you begin to hear and to see and to pick up on repetition. And that was one thing that, as I was looking at First Peter towards the end of last year and reading it and reading it and rereading it, I thought, I've never picked up on this before. And we're going to look at a number of these words and themes and phrases that Peter really wants to stress in this letter. If it's possible, read more than one translation. And why do I say that? What's valuable in reading different translations?
You get the depth of meaning that's possible there. If words are used, if different words are used in different translations, um, different scriptures translated by different people, um, you get a little more of a few different views, and the same way as when we're sitting in class and you say, well, what is your translation say? What is your translation say? You get that depth of what they could be talking about.
I would add to this, and I agree with everything that Jeannie said. I would add to this that it's important if you're going to read more than one translation that you pick different styles of translation. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to read two translations that basically have the theory, the translation theory of being as formal as possible, word for word. It's referred to as a formal translation theory, but like for instance, the New American Standard. If you back up the New American Standard with the English Standard, you're getting two translations, but they basically have almost the same identical concept of why they're doing the translation. So, if you love, for instance, and I know Brad Brooks does this, he loves the New American Standard. That's his. Moses gave him the New American Standard. So if you really like the New American Standard, I know many people do, back that up with, like for instance, the Contemporary English Bible or the New Living Bible, a translation that has what is considered to be more of a dynamic concept or dynamic theory. And if you love the Contemporary English Bible, you love the New Living Bible, some of these newer translations, then what you want to do is to back that up with the New American Standard, or back that up with the English Standard, even the old King James. Beautiful translation. So you're balancing, and that allows then what Jeannie was talking about, the different ways of sentences. In the newer translations, sentences are a lot shorter, and verb endings are a little bit more fluid. And the translators will take a Greek word or a Hebrew word in the Old Testament, and depending on the paragraph or depending on what they feel like the mood of the author might be, they might use a different English word. Whereas, for instance, in my English Standard here, the word suffer pretty much stays the same all the way through. Every time that Greek word shows up, it's translated suffer. Well, a different translation may use a different word here and there and that sort of thing. So that's just, it's not a necessity, but we have the availability. Your little electronic, whether it's your phone or your tablet, you can get on Bible Gateway, or you can get on, I don't know how many different formats there are where you can call up just with a couple of inputs, and you can get dozens of different translations. And so that's something that we have not always had. My bookshelf down in my office, I've got like almost 30 inches of different Bible translations. Well, that's kind of expensive. And it's something that I can do that not everybody can do, and not everybody that wants to do. But you can certainly get these free downloads that are easy. Dennis?
Yeah, I do a Bible study with guys that use a lot of different translations, and one of the things we're discovering is, and by the nature of it, a translation from one language to another, there's a little bit of commentary that
Always.
comes into that. And what I think I've discovered is the larger the group that does the translation, and you can usually see that in the preface of the Bible. I think the more accurate, the more confidence you can have in the objectivity of the translation.
It tends to smooth out the wonky ends, if I can use a super technical.
But smoothing is not always the most accurate either. You have to recognize that as well.
True. And that kind of points to another thing, is that a translation, a committee translation is far different from one man's, not translation,
The message.
the message, and I can't think of the word. Paraphrase. Eugene Peterson did the publication called The Message, and it's wonderful. I don't want to just absolutely demean it, but it is not really a committee translation. It is one man who commentary is a pretty good word. And so he's paraphrasing what is in the text, not necessarily translating what is in the text. And so,
and he's upfront about that.
What's that?
He's upfront.
Yes, and that's wonderful. There was the New Living Bible is actually a committee translation that started out as a single man's paraphrase, and over the years. And so the New Living Bible is actually an improvement, I believe, over the old paraphrase. And I can't remember what the paraphrase was called. Living Word or Living, I can't remember. Okay, point number 3. Pay attention to repeated words and phrases. And that's what really got me interested and really started this whole journey into the letter of 1 Peter. Was I kept seeing these words, and I thought, I kind of think Peter is interested in wanting us to know something about, for instance, suffering. And beyond that, there are even larger themes. Maybe not so much in 1 Peter, because it's so short. But for instance, in the Gospel of John, the theme of light. And you start looking at not just the word light, but how light keeps showing up. And the thing in the Gospel of John that just gives me goosebumps is that when Judas gets up and walks out in order to betray Jesus, John says, and it was night. He didn't have to point that out, but what happens at night? There's no light. Bad things happen in the darkness. Sin happens in the darkness. Water. Another thing in the Gospel of John is how many times something happens either specifically because of there being a body of water, or the water plays a significant role in what happened. Where did Jesus meet the woman at the well? Okay, and there's just so many. Another miracle or two happened in or around a body of water, and so you may not hear the word water, but it may show up as lake, or it may show up as the sea, or and in the Matthew has a series of themes that keep showing up. Luke has a series of themes that keep showing up. So we want to look for those as much as possible. Now, let's get then to the study that we will be looking at. And I haven't really, roughly about 13 lessons. I might expand some, I might contract some. So life never works out very, very perfectly for my plans. I always have wonderful plans that never end up being the way that I started out. So roughly about 13 lessons, maybe 12, maybe 14, not exactly sure. So that's where we're going to be looking at 1 Peter. There's always some technical material that is valuable to greater or lesser extents. I think, for instance, if we're looking at the book of Revelation, which I love to do, whether the book of Revelation was written, say, in the 60s or even early 70s, is a lot different than if it was written in the 80s. I grant that's only 20 years, but a lot transpired during those 20 years. Whether Matthew wrote his gospel in the 60s or 80s probably doesn't matter that much. And so it kind of depends on the text that you're looking at as to whether the date is important or not. It's kind of fun to think about. Is 1 Thessalonians the first letter that Paul wrote, or is Galatians the first letter that Paul wrote? Does it make a difference? No. But if we read 1 Thessalonians in light of Galatians already having been written, it might help us a little bit. If we read Galatians as if 1 Thessalonians has already been written, that might help us a little bit. So these are just, I don't know how I got stuck on the word wonky. Sometimes wonky is not real smooth, and sometimes wonky is just fun. I like wonky things. And so it's kind of a wonky question, kind of a nerdy kind of question. You can pick up a whole handful of different commentaries, and most of them will come down that if Peter wrote it, it was probably written in the early 60s. We don't know that much about Peter's life. From secular sources, we do know that, and later historians indicate that Peter spent a lot of his time, or at least a considerable amount of his time, in Rome, and was probably martyred in Rome. And probably early in the church history. But so we just don't have that many clues. Peter really doesn't quote any of our gospels or any sayings of Jesus. Does that mean that the other gospels or the gospels had not been written, or that Peter was unaware of them, or that he was aware of them and just didn't quote them? But it is interesting in light of the number of quotations from the Old Testament that Peter is very well read. He knows his Old Testament scriptures. We are told in verse 1 that the author is Peter, and he self identifies as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, you don't have to be a student of the Bible for very long to know that immediately somebody's going to say, well, that's not Peter. How do you know that? Well, it's somebody that just wants to be Peter. It's somebody that's writing a letter and using Peter's name so that people will pay attention to. Dennis, I don't know how many different views you get from authorship in your little study group, from conservative to liberal. I just don't understand why, if somebody claims to write something, it automatically has to be challenged. But there are, I was reading, I've got one commentary that says we can trust that this is from the Apostle Peter. And I've got another commentator that says, yeah, well, probably not. Okay. It drives me crazy sometimes. To me, there's no indication. And in fact, one of the commentators points out that one of the things that the author says, and I'll just say right now, the author, he condemns hypocrisy. He condemns not being truthful. Well, if this is not Peter, if somebody's writing in Peter's name, telling everybody else to be truthful, is that not kind of hypocritical?
Yeah, it could be something as simple as, we're told that Paul didn't physically write his letter. Peter should have given this message to somebody like Apollos, who is well educated, and Apollos used his own his own wording.
Right.
Bottom line is it probably doesn't matter.
No. Well,
God's going to make sure that we get the right message. Otherwise, none of this could make any sense.
and it wouldn't be worth anything. To go back to what Dennis said, notice chapter 5 and verse 12. Our author, and I'm going to say it's Peter, says, by Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it. Okay, so some people suggest, just as, for instance, in the letter to the Romans, we come over here to Romans, in Romans 1:1, the author identifies himself as Paul. But in Romans 16:22, it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So Tertius was the actual scribe, while Paul dictated it. It could be that Peter dictated it to Silvanus. It could be that Silvanus, and this is one theory, is that Silvanus kind of took a lot of Peter's writings, kind of collected them, put them, and he and Peter together wrote this letter. This is a circular letter. We're going to get to that here in just a moment. This is a circular letter. So a lot of thought and process went into this. This is not, for instance, Paul writing a quick little letter to
Mark.
I never. Philemon. He's not jotting down a quick little letter to Philemon. This is a well thought out, well constructed letter, and so it could be co-authored. One of the things that's pointed out, and I have no way of independently saying this is absolutely correct or incorrect. But apparently the Greek, the quality of Greek in First Peter, um, yeah, this last paragraph down at the bottom. Many scholars believe that the Greek, the quality of Greek in First Peter is the most refined Greek in the entire New Testament. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 13, the Jewish leaders look at Peter and John and they say, oh, it's just a couple of uneducated fishermen. And so that is one of the arguments that Peter the apostle did not write First Peter, is because how could an uneducated fisherman write the most refined Greek in the New Testament? What I was fascinated with, and there again, one of my commentaries pointed out that John Bunyan, everybody know who John Bunyan was? Apparently he was a shoemaker. He was a tinker. And yet he wrote one of the most beautiful, well-known works in English literature. Pilgrim's Pride? Yeah. Pilgrim's Progress. So how could an uneducated shoemaker write one of the best loved and most beautiful examples of English literature? Because he knew the English language. And so to say that Peter could not, what the Jewish leaders were saying in Acts chapter 4 was, these guys are not as smart as us. We are the highly educated, we are the scribes, we are the priests, we are the rulers. These guys are just a couple of fishermen. So we really take Acts 4:13 and blow it up beyond, I believe, the knowledge and the skill and the ability that Peter and John and Matthew and Luke and Mark ultimately had. Okay, I'm chasing rabbits. The destination, if you look on your map, in the back of your text, if you have a map or if you have an atlas, you can look up these locations that we have listed in verse 1. Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, basically Asia Minor, and I am not a scholar in geography by any stretch of the imagination, but there again, one of my sources pointed out this is basically modern day Turkey, probably a greater land mass than modern day Turkey. But it's interesting that Acts chapter 2 doesn't line up perfectly with 1 Peter 1, but I thought it was interesting that Luke adds all of these people from all over the Jewish world that have come to Jerusalem, not only for Passover, but for the Pentecost. And as he is writing to his Christian friends, Peter adds this great big long list of congregations, people, disciples that he's writing to. And so that's just something for you to consider and think about. Okay, there are, as I have pointed out, a number of words that are in 1 Peter that keep reappearing. And the more formal translation that you use, you will see this. If you use a more dynamic translation, not all of these words are going to show up in every one of these verses, but you will probably get some kind of indication, words similar to these. Peter uses the word exile or dispersion a number of times, 1:1, 1:17, chapter 2, verse 11. Granted, that's not vast number of references, but Peter wants his disciples, or the disciples of Christ, to know that they are scattered throughout the world. That's what dispersion means. They're scattered. And next week, I want to come back to this. Once we're going to look at the first couple of paragraphs in greater detail next Sunday morning. But that word dispersion is really important to the Jews. They were dispersed a couple of times in 721 BC. The Assyrians dispersed the Jews in North Israel. Then in about 586, the Babylonians came and dispersed the Jews in southern Israel. So Jerusalem was basically emptied of Jews. And it had happened again a couple of times, the Greeks, the Romans. And so the Jews were scattered throughout the world. Peter takes that word and moves it over into the Christian realm to point out that Christians are dispersed throughout the world as well. So we're going to come back and look at that once again next Sunday. But just as you read, notice how many times the word suffer or sufferings show up. Sometimes it is the Christians themselves that are suffering, but many, many times Peter refers to the suffering or sufferings of Jesus. So I've listed these there for you. The word test and testing shows up early in the book, chapter 1 and verse 7, and then later in the book, chapter 4 and verse 12. That's significant. If you pick up on a word early in a paragraph and late in the same paragraph, that's important. If you pick up on a word early in a book and late in a book, that's important. And so Peter wants us to know as disciples that we can be undergoing a time of testing, that we might be tested. And then this kind of indicates what kind of suffering the disciples are undergoing. And that is some kind of reviling, some kind of slander, some kind of insult. And once again, this is a word that our different English translations can play with. And they will probably use a number of different synonyms. But how many of you have experienced being reviled or slandered or insulted because you're a Christian, because of your faith? It can be something as simple as, oh, you're just one of those goody two-shoes. Or you just think you're better than everybody else because you go to church. You just think you're a better person. That's slander. That's insult. Something I had not picked up on all that tremendously. I should have. Peter quotes the Old Testament a number of times, even refers, maybe not direct quotation, but refers to various passages even more. And so in this short letter, notice how many different Old Testament references there are, and you might find yet even one or two or three more. He seems to love, in particular, Isaiah, but he quotes a couple of times from Psalms, a couple of Proverbs, one passage out of Leviticus. So it's fascinating how he builds his message to disciples from the message that God gave to the Jewish people. Okay, and then last but not least, my little comment there down at the bottom. I wish I knew what these scholars are pointing out so that I could explain it a little bit better. It's just the difference between reading an English, a work of English literature from somebody who really knows how to write to someone who might have a high school education and not much more. Going back and reading, well, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and how beautifully he crafts his stories. Charles Dickens, and reading how Charles Dickens crafts his stories, as opposed to somebody who writes for the World Journal. Not the finest literature in all of the English language is to be found in the World Journal. You get the point? The person writing the article gets, who, what, where, when, why, how. Yeah, okay, we get it. But it's just not Charles Dickens. It's just not Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Nor should it be. Nor should we. Don't pick up a newspaper to read about the hijinks of Oliver Twist or Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. So I wish I could explain what it is that they're seeing. Just kind of think of it in terms of our English language. As we conclude, are there any questions or comments or anything, if you have been reading 1 Peter, any questions that you have about the book or anything that we've talked about this morning that we can come back to in a later lesson and discuss a little bit more? I don't ever want to leave anybody. Yeah.
I wonder if, because Peter and the other apostles had the Holy Spirit constantly telling him to do this or that, or not do this or that, if maybe that brought out things that we wouldn't have thought of before Jesus left.
Yeah, and Jesus' own promise to the apostles was the Holy Spirit will guide you. And so we never want to separate the Holy Spirit from the, I don't say production in a bad sense, but the producing of. It is interesting that, for instance, when you begin your studies in New Testament Greek, once you get the basics kind of out of the way, almost universally, and with very, very few exceptions, the first New Testament book that you begin reading is the Gospel of John. Not because John is simplistic, but because John doesn't really, how can I explain this? He writes very directly, and not a lot of grammatical problems, not a lot of syntax problems, not that there are none, but in the more complicated Greek, for instance, Hebrews, and it was my understanding that actually Hebrews was probably the highest level of Greek, but in studying 1 Peter, other scholars say no, 1 Peter. But it's the Greek in the letter, or the sermon, treatise, however you want to refer to it, of Hebrews is very, very upper level, very flowing, very flowery. And so there's really a difference. You can read John and you can read Hebrew, and the higher that you begin to understand and to be able to read Greek, you can see the difference. I can't. I can't. And so, but very good point. that the Holy Spirit is leading and guiding and directing, while at the same time allowing the author's personality to show up. We just got through reading Galatians, and we really see Paul's personality in Galatians. He's fiery, he's upset, he's hot. Yeah, Susan.
Well, thinking of the refined Greek, if you talk to someone in England and you talk to someone in Texas, they're not going to speak the same language, even though it's all English. So I wonder if refined just means that the slang is not there. Because
Yeah.
slang in England is gonna be very different than slang in Texas, but yet if you go with a more refined, and the English, the way the word is meant to be understood, that would be more refined. There's no slang.
As Brad so beautifully puts it out, Americans and British are two basically the same people, united by or divided by a common language.
Well, I mean, even New York to Texas or New York to California, keep it in America. And
Okay.
it might be English, but it's still, if
Yes.
the slang is brought in, they're not gonna always understand what they mean.
Okay, we do have some folks getting ready to come in. We'll take a break for our worship session. If you do have any questions or comments, be sure and let me know so that we can share everybody's questions and thoughts and comments equally.